Trump second term would be times 3 Trump first term. This would be the genius who could do no wrong. It does. I mean, the great saving grace of Trump is that he is, you never interrupt the enemy while he's defeating himself. That explosion, continued explosion of demand. We call Facebook the new tobacco, new big tobacco, but its revenues are triple today what they were in 2016. Tobaccos would have been a third. Well, so I would sort of distinguish between how we use middle class in India and how we use it in America. And even, Britain and in India would have similar definitions of middle class generally means.
Welcome back to the Odisha Literary Festival 2020. Our discussion today goes beyond the physical borders of the country, yet talks about issues we all are worried about. This year's US elections was nothing short of a nail-biter, but the last 4 years have been strenuous for free speech in America. Our next speaker was in the middle of it all. Please welcome the Financial Times chief US commentator, Edward Luce. Senior journalist Kaveri Bamzai will talk to Ed about writing on Trump's America.
Begin with America and writing about Trump's America and writing about the US elections in such a divisive time. How is it, and how do you see the elections panning out? And really, how important are these elections?
Well, thank you for that introduction, and also remembering those books was very kind of you. We have goldfish memories in our profession, so yours is elephantine. I'm impressed. The perspective on this election, the 2020 presidential election, that I have is one that you hear about a lot of elections, and it doesn't happen to be true. But in this case, it does happen to be true, that this is the most consequential American presidential election of our lifetimes. Now, you could argue that 2016 was, because that resulted in the election of Trump. But you could have all kinds of caveats to that victory, that it was a tiny margin, that the FBI intervened with Hillary Clinton's emails shortly beforehand, that Hillary Clinton herself was a uniquely disliked public figure, and that therefore it was a kind of freak of nature outcome. His re-election would confirm that America wants him, and that this is a profoundly different direction on which it's going. And I think Trump's second term would be times 3 Trump first term. This would be the genius who could do no wrong, and therefore to whom there are no limits on the actions and power that he can use. And so I think it would be, if not the end of the Republic, it would be the end of liberal democracy as we know it, a Trump re-election. So it is, I think, the most important election in our lifetimes. That said, I don't think he's going to win, or at least I don't think he's going to win by free and fair means. The attitude he's got, Trump's psychology in his head, is that either he wins or he goes to jail. Now, that might not in reality be true. All that matters is that that's what he thinks, and therefore his back is to the wall. I don't think there are any real limits on which norms he would break. And therefore, an election that is close enough, where Biden's margin of victory in the popular vote wasn't large enough to close down all argument next week, is one, I think, where Trump will see an opportunity to throw dust into people's faces, to contest results, to stop the counting, to get paramilitaries around polling stations, and to try and somehow leverage a victory from the jaws of defeat, in which case we are in, constitutional crisis territory. I have no prediction which of those two it will be. The only safe prediction I have is that Biden will win considerably more of the popular vote than Trump. But in this system, that's not much of a guarantee.
Ed, regardless of that, the age of resentment is truly upon us, isn't it? I think regardless of who wins, all around the globe, we see this, whether it's Brexit or whether it's in India. Every leader in power portraying himself or herself as the victim, despite being in power, which makes no sense, that they're the outsider, that they're the people who've sort of broken through the elite, and they're the ones who've been marginalized and forgotten for so long. So the age of resentment doesn't seem to be ready to go away.
No, I don't think it is, and I think that even if Trump is defeated, Trumpism will live on.
Exactly.
And the Republican Party will remain chiefly a Trumpian vehicle. I mean, if you look at the volume of fake news, of sort of easily attributably fake news that has been clicked and liked and shared on the social media platforms, particularly Facebook, but also YouTube and Twitter, we're seeing something like 3 times the volume in 2020 in America as we did in 2016. So the demand for news that stokes your resentments or your conspiratorial view of the world, that these very sort of beguilingly simple explanations for, what are ploddingly sociological reasons for why your life is stuck. People do have this desire for magical explanations, sometimes dark magic. And that's growing and considerably. There's been quite a few studies, most recently a very good one by the German Marshall Fund here in Washington, on that continued explosion of demand. We call Facebook the new big tobacco, but its revenues are triple today what they were in 2016. Tobaccos would have been a third. So they might be viewed askance by people and disapprovingly by educated elites, but they're making out like bandits. This is serving them very well. So their incentive isn't blunted. And I think the underlying sort of combination of extreme wealth inequality, which of course leads to political inequality, because oligopolies become oligarchies. I think that, and then in the United States, and in a very different way in India, the ethnic resentments and suspicions combined with that make it very hard for politics as we used to know it to happen. It takes a Nehru or a Roosevelt, to really cut through that. And much as I like Joe Biden, Uncle Joe, and much as I admire his intentions and his decency, I think he's going to have a tough time being FDR in this climate.
Ed, I was watching a special episode of West Wing recently. I don't know whether you got a chance to catch it. And there you had, President Bartlett trying to be folksy, and his chief of staff telling him that's not the way. And he was coming back from India, where he said the granddaughter of Nehru was in power, and she had gifted him a chess set, which actually came down to her from her grandfather, and he had played chess on it with Lord Mountbatten, even as they were deciding upon the fate of independent India. And I thought to myself, that's wonderful, but how out of touch are the liberal elites in America?
Very. I mean, Bartlett, of course, is a beguiling character. Here is a Nobel Prize winner in economics.
In economics, yes.
Economics of who, when he gets angry with his conscience or with his fate, goes to the Washington Cathedral and speaks in Latin to God.
Yeah.
So, okay, this is an educated guy. The liberal elites, and I think the Democratic Party in general, have a curiously a strategic obsession with the White House. And the West Wing sort of feeds that. The West Wing feeds the idea that all power resides in one person in the White House. And as long as you've got that, then you've got power. And of course, what the conservative movement in America has learned, in a sort of funny echo of, RSS, long-term planning, is that you get the institutions from the grassroots upwards. You get the state legislatures in the American context. You get of course, the judiciary. You get block by block, state by state, the base of power, and from there you change people's minds. You set up universities, you set up think tanks, you set up whole sort of feeder supply institutions to produce the conservative governing class of tomorrow. And they've been doing that really since the 1970s. And liberals don't do that because they don't really understand the nature of power. This is ultimately, even though I'm talking about groups on the right, movements on the right, this is ultimately a Leninist strategy.
Yes.
But it's the right that's exploiting it. And I think liberals, have at some fundamental level the idea that reasonable arguments win, rather than power comes from the barrel of a gun. And I suspect if Trump loses next week, there will be great celebrations, as there should be. And there will then be an expectation that the problem is over, and it isn't, unless much more substantive and deeply rooted steps are taken to repair mainstream political power and its legitimacy in this country.
As I read what you write about the American middle class, I also think how closely it mirrors the Indian middle class as well. In America, the middle classes may be deluded. In India, they're seceding virtually. They're virtually sort of living outside India, if not physically, intellectually. And they've not invested in our own health and education system, which is why we see the broken system that we saw during COVID-19, and pretty much some of that was reflected in America as well. So really, what is it about the middle class in both our nations which leads it to allow this kind of resentment to breed in people who feel that there's too much entitlement in these elites?
Well, so I would sort of distinguish between how we use middle class in India and how we use it in America. And even, Britain and in India would have similar definitions of middle class. Generally means well off.
Yeah, in these two countries, yes.
Whereas in America, middle class actually means working class.
Okay.
So that it's like the use of the word liberal. We're divided by a common language.
Right.
So what I would
the word communal, which you must have discovered in India, means something completely different.
Yes. Now I used to think of it as like if there's a pint of milk in the fridge, anybody can use it. No milk.
But it turned out that it had to be curdled for just some of them to use it.
Very true. Now so I think that the elites in the financial elites across the world are essentially seceding, detaching from their national politics. I think that it's the sort of inverse of, I mentioned Lenin earlier, but it's the inverse of Workers of the World Unite.
Right.
This is money market investors of the world unite. And I think that what they have in common, and I'm including, the Chinese elites here, what they have in common in terms of the Ivy League schools or the Oxbridge outlets that they consider for their children, the boarding schools across the border or in their own country. I mean, I'm aware that, there are Doon schools in India and others like it, that they essentially don't really need public provided services and are very little invested in the state creating the resources to provide those services. And this is leading to a privatization of provision to those who can afford it, and therefore a decreasing care for those who can't. And it's frustrating because it's ultimately self-detonating. it's ultimately going to undermine the security and the wealth and the future of the children of these elites, because they can't sort of secede to Mars. There is still one Earth, and political instability of the kind we've been seeing in recent years, but I think could be worse in coming years, is not good for anybody's assets or investments. So I'm not appealing here to their
morality,
warmth, or humanity, exactly, simply to their self-interest. That this is something that will hoist them by their own petard eventually. And how do you explain this? Well, I guess selfishness and greed has to come into it, but it's the short-sightedness I'm focused on.
Right. And this short-sightedness, Ed, I don't know if you've been paying attention to what's happening in India. This short-sightedness is leading to a country which is really at war with itself, which is really decided that, to hell with the economy, to hell with what's happening, to hell with our broken health and education system. Let's focus on something completely different and focus all our hatred on the other, defining it in whatever way possible, by caste, religion, whatever minority comes their way. So the focus is really entirely on that. How do you explain it? In their own self-interest, it's not good for them, because even the trains are not running on time anymore.
Yeah, eventually people do get punished. Populists do get punished for not providing solutions. Eventually, I say, they're pretty good at scapegoating others for their own failure. They're, that is a great political skill. And I think that communalism, particularly as regards Muslims, is a spectacular scapegoat. It's sort of worked in many situations. And, you can conjure up great fears of Islamism. You can create self-fulfilling prophecies by radicalizing young Muslims, by excluding them from opportunity. And therefore, you can perpetuate this to some degree. I like to think, and I think I do think, that eventually this runs out. But what it runs out into is, is something, but it's hard to sort of forecast that necessarily being a benign scenario. RSS have been hard at work for generations, and this is the real difference when people talk about Trump, and the conservative movement. There's been some fairly organized, as I was discussing earlier, conservative institutional takeover and change in the last generation, but it's nothing compared to the Sangh Parivar, and it's nothing compared to that extraordinary idea, which is, ultimately something I think of as Jesuitical. You give me the child, I will give you the man. Yeah. It's the idea that politics is an offspring of culture, and if you change the culture, you get the politics. And I think that's what the Sangh Parivar has been doing for, particularly in northern India, but in many parts of India for a very long time, trying to rewire the Indian brain to the extent that it can make any number of mistakes that others would be punished for much, much more immediately in the political arena. It can get away with because it owns these people. I'm still puzzled, and I share the premise of your question as to why you wouldn't want sort of basic functioning, in the other spheres of life. Yes. And all I can assume is because there is ultimately quite a nihilistic impetus behind this, that it's never really been about Hinduism. Mm-hmm. Hinduism is a wonderfully syncretic, malleable, debatable, and sort of multifaceted phenomenon. This is, about creating a cartoonized monotheistic version of Hinduism that is directed at others, and that is premised on being directed at others. And so if the ultimate fuel here really is resentment, and fear of others, then it can only the logic suggests it can only end in conflagration. These things don't end with, like, sitting down around a negotiating table and, splitting differences. It's not of that nature.
It's a civil war.
We always sort of think of conventional civil wars. I don't think the 21st century conflict is going to resemble 19th or 18th. I think it's going to be slightly different. I mean, it could be. I feel a little bit at sea trying to predict exactly.
Oh, we'll probably just aim tweets at each other and hope we'll all die.
Right. Yes, we do have the option of muting people's accounts, which I think is far more effective than blocking. People want to be blocked. They want to know you can't hear them. Exactly. Don't let them know you can't hear them.
Yeah. So, when you talk about Trumpism surviving, I was wondering, as an outsider, you're an outsider. You were, well, a sort of outsider in India. You're an outsider in America to a great extent. How difficult or easy does it get to write about their politics? Does it make it easier? You have that perspective of, of distance?
I mean, I've been in the States now for 14 years. And, my accent doesn't reflect it. I still sound British. I mean, I joke that that's the only gene I have in common with Henry Kissinger. It sounds like I just arrived. And then I was in India for 6 years. And then before then I was here. So I've actually spent more of my adult life in outside, well, even in America than in Britain, if adulthood begins at 18. So I don't feel like a sort of complete outsider with hayseed in my hair. I know a lot of people and have been through many cycles. But I think sort of, if you're not American, you're not as easily prey to some of the slightly more saccharine narratives that Americans, for good reasons and bad, are prone to. There is a little bit of a sort of yearning for that Hollywood ending. And I think it's you can be a little bit more analytical if you're a little bit more emotionally detached from what's going on. That said, I am emotionally very invested in this democracy saving itself. When we talk about sort of pleasure from other people's misfortunes, I would have undisguised schadenfreude at seeing the back of Donald Trump, particularly if he's in handcuffs. But I think that's a bit of a fantasy. But so I think it helps. It can help. But you need to travel in this country, and during COVID, that's very restricted.
Right. So how has COVID treated America? Has it become more polarized? We saw the Black Lives Movement from a distance. It seemed very angry. Has it become much more, has it become angrier?
It's become angrier. I mean, when I arrived here, America was already pretty polarized. But I've never felt a level of toxicity like this, and it gets in the bloodstream. It's very hard to ignore it. You can't shut it out. There is a sort of bad temperedness about everyday life. There's a clear sort of yawning mistrust of institutions and of people on the other side. And the mask issue, the mask wearing politics is one symbol of this, that, liberals, effete people, politically correct people wear masks, and conservatives, real men, don't. There was a remark the other day Trump made about Biden, that Biden should also carry a purse. Yeah. So it was a very, you're like a woman, you're wearing a mask.
Yeah. And this absolutely, awful ad of that boy who stutters, such terrible below the belt stuff. I mean, he did that to Hillary as well, but I think this perhaps crosses another line altogether. I don't know. What do you think?
It does. I mean, the great saving grace of Trump is that he is, you never interrupt the enemy while he's defeating himself. And that's been Biden's strategy, really, is just give Trump enough rope. And Trump keeps asking for more rope. He doesn't understand that that this isn't about him all the time, but he makes it about him all the time. If he were talking, as recently as earlier this month, after he got COVID and was hospitalized, if he used that as a moment to say, look, I'm taking this much more seriously now. I realize most of you in America don't get the quality of medicine I'm getting. But I'm going to take this seriously. We've got to flatten this curve. This is our overwhelming. There's nothing ideological that would stop him from doing that. He's got his own psychological obsession with crushing not just the outward form of his enemies, but their inner spirit. And it's a very nasty impulse. It's a very nasty sort of human impulse that he's got, but it's happily also quite a self-destructive one, because the people who voted for him most overwhelmingly were the over 65s, and they're the most vulnerable to COVID and to being infected and to being hospitalized if they are, and dying if they're hospitalized. They're most vulnerable on all levels, and they are now backing Biden by double digits. So it's a very self-defeating sort of ad hominem campaign that he's running. And Biden's wise, I think, just to basically keep his mouth shut and let Trump continue talking.
Both in India and in America, we have this TINA problem. There is no alternative. I mean, perhaps if there was someone who was a little more energetic than Biden, a little more, a little more charismatic, perhaps, it would make the choice easier. You have the same problem in India. Do you see that as something that we share?
Yeah, the Democratic Party, like the Congress Party, has been having a talent generation problem. It's finding it hard to create the kinds of figures that that can speak to all Americans and do so convincingly, and have policies to match it and strategies to match it. It's slightly different with the Congress Party in that it's being stifled by the Gandhi family, and that's to me a source of constant astonishment that Rahul Gandhi is not retired and got out of the way and tried to create space for other leaders to come forward. And therefore, I think in India, the TINA problem is worse because Congress is correspondingly much, much smaller an opposition party than the Democrats have been during Trump. And so that's a real concern. I don't know. I don't know what can have gone through Rahul Gandhi's mind, or whether it's Priyanka can talk to him, or whether there's just so much sycophancy built into Congress culture that he never hears what he needs to hear. But I share I'm afraid rather curdled view of what that family's become that my friend Ram Guha has. She's like, you really have to get out of the way. And I see no signs of them getting out of the way. Democrats will have an opportunity, I suspect, under Biden to attempt to rejuvenate. I'm skeptical, given the deep cultural proclivities of the Democratic Party, that it's going to change its ways either. But its ways are less self-harming than the Congress Party's ways.
What you talked about the nastiness that's crept into public life. What about the deep level of misogyny as well? Because we saw it with Hillary's defeat. I really think she was defeated because she was a woman, and because she was Hillary as well. I think she was just, as you said, so tone deaf to what America wanted. But what do you think of that deep level of misogyny? Can that be rolled back?
So I think bound up with fear of a multiracial society. I mean, really, if you look at ultimately what the conservative movement has become in the United States, it's increasingly a white majority that thinks of itself as a minority, and believes all this demographic destiny stuff, that they will be in a minority by the 2040s, which is actually not. It's not a particularly plausible way of thinking of America, because just like Irish and Italians were outsiders in the 50s, they were Catholic immigrants who were not defined as WASPs. Well, they became WASPs.
Yeah.
And when they became WASPs, they became Republican voters, and they are now part of the white minority. So the Hispanics will, once the Republican Party stops being overtly racist, half the Hispanics will become white, inverted commas. And for all intents and purposes, Indian Americans will too. The ultimate issue here is between blacks and everybody else.
Right.
It's a history of slavery. And that's, the rest is sort of a kind of I think a red herring. That's the history of race in this country. It's slavery. And so, I guess what you've got is a Republican Party that, unless it is repudiated on a massive historical scale more than once, is going to continue to go down this road of stoking fear of change and of modernity, which of course includes female independence and autonomy, financial and over her body. That's all part of this sort of terrifying modern world that's coming. And the legal sort of philosophy, the judicial philosophy that they support is, I think, going to bear fruit as well. There's probably going to be a reversal of Roe v. Wade, the right to abortion, probably going to be at least chipping away at the gay marriage ruling. And there's just going to be more attacks on female moral and bodily autonomy going forward. I see it as all part of the same pathology around fear of becoming a minority. It's sort of, they're using the Christian imagery to do that, in the same way that, politics hijacked Hinduism, politics has hijacked Christianity. It bears such little relation to, the gentle versions of these religions we know members of our family practice. That it's
love,
it is a hijacking.
But what you said was very interesting, that even if Trump loses, Trumpism will survive. Trumpism, Roger Ailes-ism, whatever you want to call it, that model of politics, which is fueled by hate and fueled by fear of the other. Will it become the prevailing model for the whole world? Are we going to see that everywhere? You look at France right now, and the level of bigotry is also quite astounding.
It is. I'd like to think there is a sort of thesis, synthesis, antithesis, synthesis, sort of dialectic going on here, where you have this populist wave that's been going on for years. It's then defeated, but it's not banished. It reinvents itself and comes back. And then we get the synthesis where normal politics sort of absorbs some of it. That's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic one is it simply derails liberal democracy altogether. I think that the politics of resentment is here to stay. I think the politics of created trust in institutions is here to stay. I think the populists, have an agenda to hollow out those institutions. And I think that, you cannot, in any of these examples, ignore the role of the high-moneyed elites, the plutocrats, who are getting lower taxes out of this, and in some cases, zero taxes. and who are prepared to pay that price. At least some of them. There's a split elite. There's a split moneyed elite. Some think that this is too high a price to pay. Some don't. And that's part of the explanation of populism, is to see who's funding it and who's benefiting from it. Because, when you look at Trump, 2016, saying we will focus on the forgotten American, even if he was just talking about the white forgotten American, he's completely ignored them. Yeah. He's not put any money into their lives, into upgrading their skills, into infrastructure, broadband, healthcare. He keeps promising a healthcare plan. He doesn't have one. But he has, with alacrity, deregulated the regulatory agencies in Washington, cut taxes, and done everything he can to help those who funded his campaign. So he's fulfilled his promise to them, but not to the so-called forgotten American. And I think history tells you that when societies get more and more unequal, the politics gets worse and worse. The incentive for those who benefit from an unequal economy to encourage politics to get worse grows. To scapegoat people on the basis of race or religion, that grows. They want to prevent class politics. They want to prevent politics where the division of the pie becomes the topic of the conversation, as opposed to the color of your neighbor. And so there is a great incentive there for plutocratic elites to stoke populism. But of course, it's a tiger they can't control. So the answer to your question is not clear. I don't have a sort of Nostradamus prediction, but it's with those sort of key players in mind. And I think some cultures, some democracies, it's much harder to do. It's much harder to do partly because they're less diverse. There's less raw material for scapegoating.
Right. Just the last question, Ed. We've seen the role of the media in India as well. It's been less than credible. It's been less than independent of late. It's been very much part of the new establishment, and it has sort of forwarded the new agenda. How is it in the US? Is there a lot more diversity, or is the loudest voice still the one that's heard?
I watched the Indian media's the space for good, vibrant, independent media in India shrink with some alarm. The sort of Times Now kind of culture, Arnab Goswami kind of voice has become louder than I feared it would become, and the sort of what's the word? Chamjagri towards power.
Yes.
Has become more sort of obvious and fawning and upsettingly adulatory than I was fearing. But India, is I know got a million vernacular languages, well, maybe 18 officially. And different spaces for media. And I don't feel able to fully judge. I'm purely talking about the Anglophone, not purely, but mostly talking about the Anglophone media here. I think it's not quite as bad in America, but it's got a lot worse. The direction is the same. The direction is the same. The number of people who are bypassing official media, established conventional media, altogether keeps growing.
Yeah.
And that's a concern. So the sort of business model of independent media is shakier than it's ever been. There are certain really sort of big brands like the New York Times, or the Financial Times for that matter, that can survive in that. But no, at the local level, in the States, there's been complete decimation.
Yeah.
Complete decimation. And And you need to, I don't know, you need to tax Facebook. You need to take some of this back and invest in local journalism. There are more than enough journalists in DC. I'm not worried about DC being covered.
Yeah.
I'm worried about the world being covered and the states being covered, above and below and around. We're all 7-year-old kids chasing the same football in Washington.
Absolutely.
But the rest of the field is clear. There are no players on it.
And COVID, as you said, makes it so much worse. You can't even travel so much anymore. For a journalist, how tough is that? Especially during the elections.
We just Zoom, we travel virtually, which is not the same thing.
Not the same thing at all. Thank you so much, Ed Luce, for being so lucid as always, and a pleasure to talk to you. And I think there's obviously going to be a new book in the offing, perhaps after the election. Are you working on one?
I am. I'm working on a longer biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was
Yes.
America's national security advisor, but also one of the grand strategists of American foreign policy when America used to have a foreign policy.
Why did you choose him, Ed?
In my view, he's as big as
Kissinger?
He's but less well known. So there's enormous space there to explain his life, and it's a fascinating life. He grew up in Poland before the Second World War, and didn't speak a word of English till he was 15, and then invented much of the modern English vocabulary of statecraft. So he's a fascinating figure who's much less well known than he should be.
Great. Thank you so much. I look forward to reading that as well. And come back to India and write a sequel.
I would love to, when permitted.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We hope you loved this session. Thank you for watching. You can catch the schedule for OLF 2020 and watch all the other sessions at www.newindianexpress.com and www.eventexpress.com. If you're more of a social media person, catch these clips live on our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube channels.